So this is the second part of our um, client-side testing. We're again using Karma as our test runner to load our tests in a browser. So we finished up last time by looking at how Karma gets set up. And I've made no code changes, but I've moved things around a little bit. So where before we just had one spec file, what I've done here is I've gone and I've created this browser folder with a JS file below it. This is more of a better architecture to set things up. And here's my employee. Fairly simple, right? We've got this constructor function here. We're passing in a name. And I've separated out this from my testing, which you'll see is inside of my test folder. And the reason why I have another folder called browser is that I might have server-side tests as well. And both of these might be in this folder. So I might have tests for my server and tests for my browser or my client. Sometimes you'll see those folders are named client. And what I'm doing here is that here's where my test is. So here I've got my test, and here I've got my employee. The only modification that I had to get in order to load these correctly is I've got to be very specific with Karma. If things aren't in one file, here I've got to give a list of files to load, and they've got to load in a particular order. Source code first, test code second. So here, even though I only have two files, I could have filled this in and said, this is going to be employee.js and employeespec.js. What I'm doing here is actually specifying, hey, look, load all the source files and load all the test files. And that's fine. I'm really in the same boat that I was before. And if I go over here, and this was running before, let me just give myself a little room here. If I run this, I should see that both tests end up passing. Let me just point out one other thing that's probably worth doing. Let's say that you ended up having, let's say that you kind of messed up and either you put something in the wrong folder or you misnamed something. So I'm just going to change this file, and I'm going to, actually, let's do this. Let's move it. Or we could just do this. I'm going to change this file so that, let's say that I had a misspelling here, and I named that directory JSS. Now, if I go back here, I'm going to see an error because, again, when it looks over here, it's looking for a JS folder to load this, and it can't find it. Now, you might look at this and, it might not be totally clear what the issue is, but you just know, hey, look, it's not finding my files. If you want to know what files ended up getting loaded, there's a setting that you have here, and you're not going to want to use this all the time because it's pretty wordy, is that there is a couple of settings you could use here. So I'm going to run this instead of an info. I'm going to run it in debug. And again, whenever you have a change to your config file, you got to rerun here. This is going to give us a ton of output. But one of the things that it should show us is what files it is attempting to load. And if we go and look at this, we could scroll up here, and we might be able to see that, again, you could see all the different things that Karma is doing. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So if we looked over here, we could probably see that, it's not even, it's making a request for our spec file, but it's not loading our employee file. So, this is a way that you could maybe debug that things aren't working the way that they should work. If we went back here and we ended up changing the name of our file back to JS, our tests now should be passing. And if we went over here, we could actually see that it was able to load our employee JS file. So again, if you need more information when your tests are running, you might run in debug mode, but for the most part, it's got a little bit more information than I need to know. And you could look and see what other settings you might use. I tend to just run this in info. And again, my key thing here, I know it's beating a dead horse a little bit, but the idea that we want to go in whenever we make a change to our config file, right? We want to make sure that we end up restarting our tests. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to want to write an Angular app. And as a result of wanting to write an Angular app, the first thing that I'm going to need to do is, usually I'm going to have some file called app.js. And within my app.js, I'm going to have something like Angular module app. And let's just assume right now we're not going to have any dependencies. So if I went back and I went to run this, I've got a reference error because Angular doesn't exist. Again, my Karma framework is being told to load files, but one of them is not Angular. So I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to say npm install Angular. Now this is not a dev dependency, and I'm going to save it. And this is going to save Angular in my node modules folder, and I would set up a static route with those node modules folder. If you didn't want to use node, you could just as easily, set these up with Bower. And I'm going to go over here, and here I could see that I've got my Angular set up here. And what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to bring this in. And the way that I'm going to bring it in is I'm going to go to my Karma config, and I'm going to specify right off the bat one file that I'm going to need is in node modules. And there's a folder called Angular, and there's an angular.js. And again, once I end up doing this, when I go back here, I can end up running my test again, and my test should be passing again because it'll know about Angular. Now, this is great, but the sort of sticking point that you might run into here is what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to use this. Right now, we've got this employee file that's just sitting here as this global function. Again, that's just the nature of JavaScript running in the browser, unless you end up using some of these other libraries that sort of wrap these functions into something else. But we want to use Angular. Angular gives us the ability to wrap things in our application. And the way that we would end up doing that is to simply, do something like Angular module, and we're going to call our module. Our module is called app, and we're going to set up a factory. Factory, again, just allows us to export some object that we're going to use. And what we want to do is we want to export the employee object. And I'm going to call this employee. And I'll go down here. So we're just doing sort of the bare minimum of Angular here, in the sense that all we're doing is wrapping our function that we have already inside of this employee factory. We're not doing any controllers or anything yet. We're going to start out with this simple factory, and then we'll do a factory that'll end up making requests, and we'll see how to test that out. But here's my factory, and I want it to return the employee. So here's the idea that if we had some business logic in our application, we might wrap it in this employee, and we're using Angular to basically set it up so that it's not sitting out there in the global namespace, which is not great. We want to try to avoid that, like the plague. And if we go back over here, we'll see that our test won't pass because it doesn't know what employee is. So this is where the testing gets to be a little bit tricky, in the sense that, here we are inside of our employee spec, and we've got to figure out how do we pull in a factory in here. And the fact of the matter is that we could do it easily if we had we could do it fairly easily within our application, right? We could end up, how do we end up getting factories? We get them through dependency injection, but we have nothing to inject into right here. Well, what happens here is that there is a library that allows us, that was written with Angular, that's used to test Angular. And what it allows us to do, and I know that this is going to look a little bit strange here, but there is this, when you end up loading this library that we haven't loaded yet, it gives us the ability to say, hey, look, I want to test out a specific module. I want to make this module available for injection at some point. And again, I know that code looks a little bit weird. One thing we know about that code, we know a little bit about functional programming. Calling that is going to end up returning a function. But right now, if we went to run this, we would end up getting another error. And that error is to say, I don't know what module is, so I don't really know what to do here. Well, module is defined in a library, which, again, if you're doing Angular testing, this is one of the things that you're going to load. It's called Angular mocks. And again, you can see that this is a very popular library. This is not something that you're going to use outside of testing, so we're going to install it. We're going to kill this, and we're going to install it. And we'll say npm install Angular mocks save dev. So again, if it's things that you're using for testing, right, they're going to be saved as a development dependency. And if we go up here, that gets installed fairly quickly here. And what we're going to do, we can see actually that this ended up just loading a library, right, just a JavaScript file. And we'll go back to our config, and we'll specify, and again, the order becomes important here. This is going to be a very similar path. So this is going to be Angular mocks JS. And if we go back, we could just make sure we name that correctly. Now, once we do that, we could go back and we can run our tests again. Our test is still going to fail, but at least it's going to know what the module is, right? We're getting that error that it says doesn't know what an employee is. So the question is, how do we do dependency injection? And the first couple of times you do this, this is going to seem a little bit weird, but eventually it'll make a lot more sense, or it'll just seem less weird because you've done it a lot. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to create a variable up here for my employee, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Angular, hey, look, I want you to go out and find my employee. And so I'm going to go here, and I'm going to do a before each. And Angular mocks has another method called inject. And the way that inject works is that you pass inject a function with the names of the modules you want to bring in here. So I'm going to bring in employee here, and here's my function that's passed in here, and there's, again, that's why the syntax looks a little bit weird, but again, we know that this is basically going to end up giving us a function back. So once you have a module installed, you have the ability to inject. And just to show you that this is in fact working, I'm going to make one modification to it, just to show you that this is working. If I say console log employee, okay, again, my test is still probably going to fail, but let's see. You can see actually that this tells me, hey, look, employee, here's my function that I logged out, right? It was able to go and actually find, that's my constructor function that I ended up passing back from my factory. The thing that I want to show you here is that, you know, I could name this, you know, underscore employee, and, you know, I could do this and say underscore employee and underscore employee, because again, this gets injected by name, so I don't really have much of a choice here. So I would have to say, here's my employee that's gonna be my factory, and inject it. And once I end up doing that, I should pass again, which I do. But this is kind of ugly. Why do I have to go and change my tests here? Why can't I just call this employee? And again, we've got a problem where we've got our parameter that's being passed, sort of knocking out our variable that we want set here. But Angular makes it a little easy for us. Angular says, hey, you know what? If you want to do this sort of thing, we'll also inject in the testing environment. If you put an underscore before and after what you want to inject, we'll still find it for you, right? We'll basically assume that you ran into this situation that we just ran into, and now we can do this. So again, we're injecting in, we've got our module, we're injecting in this. Again, in terms of code, these are the two lines of, these are the two methods that you're going to use in your before each. You're going to load your module, you're going to end up loading your employee, and now if we go over here, our tests will pass again. So what this has given us the ability to do is to now write Angular tests. And we could write some tests that maybe are, just to sort of make this a little bit more detailed. Now maybe we can go over here and say something like, let's see, it has a name of Mo. Here's creating an employee. And we could go over here and maybe write some more tests and say something like describe. Let's say we were going to do our situation where an employee had regions. So we'll say has region. So we're going to test out the has region method of an employee. And sometimes you'll see that this is a method. You'll say, you might put this in your test just to show that it's a method. And we might go over here and do something like has region method exists. Again, just to get this to pass, and I'll build this out a little bit. But again, you can start by writing your test. And you could say, hey, what do you expect? Well, I expect I'm going to have an employee and has region, again, just to be defined. We could specify that it's a function, but again, I'm just sort of building this out a little bit at a time. And this doesn't work because, in fact, employee is not defined. So we'll go in and do our before each. And we'll go over here and we'll create a local variable for employee. And we'll say employee equals new employee. Again, this is now, we're getting this from Angular, but again, all that factory did was export or pass back this constructor function. And so now if we do this, we'll get a different error, and the error is going to be that it doesn't have that method, right? So let's go back to our code here, and we'll specify this as a prototype, as region, and again, this is continuously running, so we see that it has the region method. So that's our starting point, and we could go over here and let's do something like this without sort of going too crazy here. So we have a region, and let's also just do a little test. We'll say expect employee. So when we end up creating an employee, we want to have the regions set up by default. If we didn't pass any regions in here, we're going to say to equal an empty array. And this is done incorrectly, but we'll fix this in a second. So now, again, you can imagine what this is going to be. It's going to say, this is not going to work because I expected undefined to equal an array. So let's go back to our, let's actually open this up in a new tab here. And we'll go back to our employee. And we'll go in here and we'll say, we're going to pass an employee a name. And let's just say if there's not a name, let's say, well, let's not worry about the name here. We're going to pass in regions. And we'll say this dot regions equals the regions that were passed in, or an empty array. So we go back here. Now we'll see that it exists, and we'll see that it ends up equaling this empty array. So it's also worth noting, and I actually thought this was going to fail before, so this is where you get confusion, or at least I do, between the different libraries, and in particular how the expectation libraries work. Again, Jasmine has its own built-in expectation library. Mocha doesn't. In which case, you end up using something like Chai. So just to show you something a little bit different, right? To be means if we were comparing them, it would be comparing the exact same object. And since these are two different arrays, this would end up failing. And here it's looking for, hey, are these the exact same object, which they're not. The way that equal works is equal goes in and says, hey, look, I'm going to look at this array, I'm going to look at that array, I'm going to see if they have the same values, in which they do. So, and let's actually change that. This is not going to be exist. This is going to be defaults to an empty array. Okay. So here's our has region test. And let's actually go up and let's modify something. We're going to have some method where we can end up toggling a region. So if the employee has the region, we'll take it away. If they don't have the region, we'll add it. So let's go over here. And here's our new employee. And this is going to be toggle region. So again, if we wanted to sort of build this up a little bit at a time, and we expect that toggle region is going to exist, and we'll go over here, and we expect that toggle region is going to be defined. Toggle region. And this will fail. And again, we could go back and just build this out a little bit at a time and have another prototype. Actually, has region. Doesn't even test anything, so we'll write a test for that. But we're going to go over here, and now this will pass. Let's actually go back and specify, hey, we're going to create an employee. We'll give them the North region. And we expect this is going to be North. We won't say defaults to an empty array. Oh, we could. Let's keep that. Well, we're not really testing that, so I'm going to get rid of that. And we'll say has regions. This test probably would have been better off in our constructor, but we'll keep it here for the moment. We'll clean things up in a little bit. So here's our sets regions, and we're going in here. And the reason why this doesn't work is that we need to put in a first parameter for Mo. And now this ends up passing. And so let's go in here. And when we end up saying has regions, let's actually change this test. We'll say has North region, right? So here we've set up an employee. We're testing out has region. We've set them out with North. Has the North region. So what we'll call is we'll say has region. Does this employee have region North? And this should equal true. And it doesn't because we end up haven't returned anything, haven't implemented anything here. So when we find out if an employee has a region, we're going to return, and we'll say this dot regions index of a region that we pass in is not equal to -1. And this is going to be the region that we pass in, and that should be enough to get that test to pass. So now, once we have that test passing, let's just go back and do our toggle region. Again, we're not going to totally build this out, but let's say that we went in here and we say, here's our new employee, Mo, and this is going to be, let's make it south. So here, if we were to sort of describe the context of this test, we're starting out with an employee named Mo, who's got only one region of south. And so we know that the toggle region exists, and we'll say that calling toggle North removes the region. So what do we actually expect to have happen here in our test? Well, really inside of our test here, we're going to have some expectation that this employee has region north to equal false, which is not going to happen, right? Because he's got that region. So we're going to have to do some code here. Let's just see, we've got a error message here, line 50, so somewhere on this line. Expect employee has region north. I forgot a parenthesis. And that's because we set them up with south. So we'll say south here, south, and this will end up failing. So what we want to do here is we want to toggle south. So we could go over here and say employee toggle region south. And we'll go back to our employee and we'll say here's a region. And we'll say if this has region, now we know we need to get rid of it. So we're going to find the index of that region. We'll say IDX equals this dot regions index of region. This is going to give us the region. And we'll say this dot regions dot splice at the index 1 value. And at this point, we're not going to worry about the return method here. And in this case, they don't have the region. Or we could actually keep this simpler and do an else maybe. And we'll go over here and we'll say this dot regions and we'll push this region. So this should end up doing the case for when we end up toggling a region. If they don't have it, it'll end up adding it. Although we're not testing for that, we could test for it in a second. So that'll remove the region, that's correct. And let's just add one more test here, and that'll be for if they don't have the region. So we'll say calling toggle north will add the region. Again, it's a pretty simple test here, but nice to have a test suite happening, something we could build up. And we're going to add north, and we expect it's going to have north to equal true. Now this is going to pass, but let me just also point out one other thing. You always want to start off with a failure. So toggle north adds the region, and in order to do this, let's actually go here. Let's comment that out so that we can see that expected false to equal true. We go from red and to green. You always want to make sure you're testing what you think you're testing. And once you have your test working, right, you could maybe make your code a little bit cleaner, possibly by saying, this looks a little bit messy here. Maybe there's a little bit of a nicer way to do it. Maybe I should do this and say, hey, look, if you don't have the region, maybe you could end up pushing it and returning, and otherwise we'll put this in here. So you're sort of dealing with a little bit less code here. And let's just see if that works. So if they don't have the region, we add it, and then we're gone. And you can determine whether or not you want to return something from this as well. Right now, toggle region doesn't return anything. You don't necessarily need it to return anything, but this will fail, right? No, it's good to know. Okay, so let's figure out why that is. And so this is going to be somewhere in here, and here we're just missing a parenthesis. So again, what it gives you the ability to do, if you went in and started refactoring your tests, you're going to have some level of confidence that your test is going to, that your refactoring is going to work. And that's a huge advantage of writing these tests, because you can end up refactoring your code. If there's a problem with your test passing, you can figure out what that issue is. Is it an issue with your tests? Is it an issue with your code? Most likely, if it worked before, it's going to be an issue with the refactoring itself. So just to sort of summarize here, again, we ended up adding a little bit more functionality for our employee, but the other, I want to do that. The other thing that I just wanted to make sure that we were all, that you were comfortable with, was this idea that when you're bringing in Angular, you're obviously going to have to bring in the Angular library. And again, we've just written tests. We haven't tested this out in a browser at all, but I think we would have a pretty high confidence. I think we'd be pretty confident that this would work when we would start including it in a file that we would serve to the client, because our tests are running here. And the key here is that when you're doing Angular testing, and you're using the Angular framework, you have to bring in your module with a before each, and by calling that module function. And then when you want to do dependency injection, you have to inject, and here we're going to end up injecting our employee. This is where these underscores come in pretty handy, because we could just take this employee. So basically we are testing out our employee factory. And this factory is just going to have some business logic that's associated with it. The next thing that we'll do, which is going to be a little bit more complicated, is to actually start testing out a factory that's going to make calls to our back end. So this is our employee object, but let's actually, we're going to end up creating another factory that actually is making our calls to the back end, and we'll end up testing that out, and then we'll go from there to testing controllers.